base and the starting point is continuing that legacy. Shanae earlier mentioned speaking from the oracles of our ancestors, you know, and we are those living oracles and the bottom of the oracles. And I believe some of those oracles are in the room with you currently, you know. So in beginning that thread, I want to do a shout out, as you said. I want to do a shout out to some of the oracles from our generation.
Yes.
I want to shout out the spirit and the legacy of Bessie, the spirit and the legacy of Fatima Mier, the spirit and the legacy of Belinda Martin, the spirit and the legacy of Mary Magdalene, the spirit and the legacy of Kotoa, the spirit and the legacy of everybody who technically calls themselves a mother, and more particularly an African mother. Since we are the biomodulus of this planet, you know, we are the primordial woman of everybody who populates this planet. So for me, that's an important starting base, and a starting point, and it's an internal fact that can never be revoked, can never be denied, can never be written out of history. So that is the big national and international dialogue. If one really, really wants to be honest and true to themselves about the debates and the issues that we're facing. The issue that we're facing is one of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And if that sovereignty is in question, at stake, compromised, it means African women are compromised. And then if I drill down further, as we see currently playing out in the Cape, and as we know currently playing out in this country, the identity of the so-called Kwa woman, or the so-called colored woman who is a Kwa woman, is basically compromised, is at question, is under threat. And in that spirit, I believe it's important for us to be able to, in the tradition of oracles, rewrite our narrative and take back our story. There's a big leadership vacuum in South Africa currently, and for all intents and purposes, the most astute leadership seen in the world, even if you reference European countries, currently are countries led by women. Look at Namibia, for example. President and deputy president are female. Look at the shifts and changes in that country within a matter of months. And look at the state of the nation. If women's health, empowerment, agency, positioning, parity in terms of pay and salaries, if that is not addressed, nothing will ever go right. Ever, ever, ever. Because we are being carrying that epigenetic memory of lack, disenfranchisement, slavishness, beggardom. We carry that over to our children, unfortunately. And in South Africa currently, based on creating a poor class, the Kwa woman, the so-called colored people, have now been forced and compromised to become that poor class, purely based on the fact that the writers of this illegitimate history don't want to be reminded that once history is rewritten, the table and the pyramid turns completely upside down, and the first will become last. And the first currently becoming last, in their limited scope, thinking, vision of how restitution can happen, means that they might become the poor class. But that when I say limited, I mean that our notions of restitution and the models that have existed past and the models that we could possibly create in the future aren't necessarily meant to disenfranchise other groupings, other people, or let me say other peoples, if I put it that way. We are one humanity, but for the sake of this argument, our intention is not to disenfranchise other people. That wouldn't be justice, that wouldn't be corrective. But the implications economically, the implications spiritually, politically, and on all other levels would be that. And I feel that even within our country, that's a level or a layer of the argument that we're going to have to very, very specifically address at some point. When it comes down to rands and cents, and what has to ultimately happen when we create new systems, when we either disengage completely from the system, will be where is our treasure chest, warrior chest of centuries of restitutive monies that have to be paid back to us. And that's a whole other conversation, but a necessary conversation.
Yes.
And I think it's going to be ultimately important for women to be at that table. and this brings me back to addressing the leadership vacuum within our Khoisan movement, but also the leadership vacuum in terms of politics as we currently see it. There are hardly any women who can reference, or we could say are standout politicians. Hardly. There is no secession conversation happening in South Africa, and you hear the idea of elections being flaunted, but who is there to consider?
Yes.
Every political party has denied us, every political party has let us down, every political party is literally just about maneuvering and using the vote of women, and chances are, based on recent stats, we still outnumber, as a collective group, we outnumber the men in this country, which means if you disenfranchise the woman, you're disenfranchising the youth as a whole, which means you've clipped the wings of our potential future.
Yes.
So I hope that to an extent I've addressed some of what I feel is a segue into this conversation about what that legacy really means. And I don't want to take way too much more time on it, but it's this idea that our oracles, even though we don't have, ultimate access to the records that we should, our oral history isn't carried or shared and recorded enough. But I'd venture a wild guess that the economic systems of what our San culture operated around did not in any way, shape or form, especially if women were the gatherers and men were the hunters, we have to look at it that way for the sake of argument. If women were the gatherers, essentially you have a stake at whatever is being brought to the proverbial table. Or you are the table, But collectively we know we are the table, because we're not speaking about separatism.
Yes.
So I don't want to veer off into many other sub-themes and sub-threads, but I feel that is an important talking point that we should carry forward.
No, that was Gangan's